delay is an extremely useful tool in producing and mixing music, but it's also one of these tools that a lot of home studio producers only have a basic understanding of how to make it sound super interesting and unique. And in this video, I'm going to break down several techniques with delays that will help you use it more creatively. Now, let's start by laying a really good foundation by making sure that you are starting with using delays in a way that is more easily adjustable, and that is by making sure that you are primarily using delays with buses and not directly on the channel you're wanting to be affected by that delay. Now, I'm not saying I never use delays on individual channel strips, but if you want a lot of control over your delays, then you should be using a bus primarily. So here's a very quick rundown of how to do that. And if you want to just get to the first technique, then just go to this time in the video to get started. All right, so if we're looking at buses right now, obviously this is in Logic Pro. Every DAW is going to be slightly different, but you can see down here, this is where the buses or the sends exist. So if I want to create a bus or send this vocal to something to be affected, I'm going to go down here to buses, and then I'm going to basically pick where I want this to go. So bus 13 could be good. It doesn't really matter the number. It's really kind of arbitrary as long as you know what it is that you're working on. And then this little knob down here is going to determine how much of this audio signal we're going to send to the bus, which is right here. So think of a bus like this. We're going to take this audio signal, in this case it's a vocal, and I can send 100% of that audio to a bus where then I can control that bus completely separately with like a delay, for example, which we'll be showing you in a second. So I'm going to crank this up to 0 dB right there, and that is sending 100% of this vocal. Now, if I don't put anything on this channel, then we're going to get twice as loud of a vocal, which is not good. That's not what we want. But what we're going to do is grab a delay, and then on whatever delay you're using, I'm just using Comeback Kid, we're going to set the dry signal to 0 and then the wet signal to 100. And now we are only getting the delay on this channel strip, and we can control the volume of that delay using the fader. And that's like the super fast version of buses. I have a whole video on it. I'll leave that in the description down below if you want. Now, for all these techniques I'm going to be showing you, I'm going to be using a vocal example, but you can use this on vocals or instruments, so get creative with this. Let's jump into the very first technique, and that is that pros shape their delays tonally. Here's what I mean. I'm talking about using either EQ or other effects to adjust the tonal characteristics of the delay. Some of these delays are going to have some options, like Comeback Kid, there's a high and a low cut. Most delays are going to have that as an option, which means you can filter out the delays. But what if you just want more brightness on that delay? Well, you can do that using EQ. So we have our delay right here. We're just going to go ahead and use the chorus. All right, so here's what this sounds like. I'm just going to turn the delay down, and this is what the delay sounds like on this particular vocal with nothing done to it. All I did was I threw the vocal on, I set the time to what I needed, my feedback to what I needed, and we're going to play this and hear what this sounds like.
Sky on fire, sky on fire, sky on fire, sky on.
So in this case, we're basically just getting a direct repetition of what that vocal sounds like. And that's not exactly fitting the character or the quality of what this track calls for. That delay feels very out of place. So one of the ways that we can help this feel a little better is by going in with an EQ. I'm just going to go ahead and use a stock vintage tube EQ. And what I could do is I could crank some of the highs on this to add some shimmer and some brightness, maybe drive it a little bit. And now it's going to sound a little bit different characteristics wise.
Sky on fire.
See, it's a lot brighter. It has more of a bite to it just by adding some shimmer, some brightness on it. I added that right out about 8K and a little bit of drive on this EQ as well. You can do this with a handful of different ways. Like for example, maybe we don't want to add brightness to it, but instead what we could do is we could just add a typical channel EQ strip like this and filter out the highs. Let's just go ahead and filter out about 2500, 2300. And this is what this is going to sound like now. This is now going to have a very filtered, almost underwater kind of sound.
Sky on fire.
And the beauty is that you can ultimately determine what the context of your track even calls for in the first place. So this is the very first thing you need to understand, is that you can radically change the tonal characteristics of your delays, and you should not be just using a delay and then calling it a day. That's not going to sound very unique. And now the next technique is one that I've been using all over the time, especially on exposed vocals like this vocal, and that is to use a reverb after your delay to make sure that the delay does not sound dry. And this is why having your delay on a bus is crucial, because I can actually add a reverb in this chain right here on the bus after the delay to then have a reverb affecting that delay. So in this case that we're working on right now, the main vocal is very wet. It's very verbed out. It's very big. It's very spacey. And so to have a delay that does not have that same quality sounds rather strange. It sounds out of character. So we could do a couple things. The very first is we could actually send this bus to that reverb that the other vocal is going to. So we could just go in here and we could do the long chorus verb on this. That's one option. Now it would sound like this.
Sky on fire, sky on fire.
So you can now hear that this delay actually has a reverb on it. So that is one option, but maybe you want that reverb to be a different kind of reverb, or you want to have more control over that individual reverb. Well, that's where you can actually just throw it directly on the channel strip. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use Baby Audio's Spaced Out. I realize I'm using all Baby Audio plugins. That's not intentional, it just is what it is. I really like the Spaced Out plugin. Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and listen to this with a different type of reverb. All right, so let's take a listen.
Sky on fire. Sky on fire.
Maybe that's a little bit wetter than I would want, so we could probably bring that down a bit, but I think you can get the idea is that you can really add so much character to your delays by simply adding a reverb after that delay. And this brings me to the next technique, and that is that pros are going to use saturation, distortion, and other character effects to make their delays sound significantly more unique. To me, if a delay is just a repetition of the exact vocal and that's it, that's just going to tend to be a little bit boring and bland. And I want my delays to fit the context of the track and also sound unique. Now, we've already added a tube EQ on here, and this tube EQ does have some drive. So that is going to add a little bit of grit to this. So what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to go to the second chorus, which sounds significantly bigger. I'm just going to play this with no delay first.
Sky on fire. Sky on fire.
So you can hear obviously there's really big drums, big bass, the strings are doing a little bit more. So this is where we would probably want to add a delay that is going to sound a little bit more unique and a little bit different, maybe more mangled, maybe more distorted. So we're going to go ahead and do this. We're going to turn this same bus on that we were working with before. And what we're going to do is I'm going to turn the wetness on that reverb down just a smidge. But what we're going to do instead is we're going to go ahead and get rid of that tube EQ. And instead, we're going to add Effect Rack, which is Sound Toys. We're going to add Decapitator, and Decapitator is a distortion plugin. I'm going to show you here in a second how you can actually do the same thing within Comeback Kit as well. A lot of delays are going to have some of these options built right in, but this is if you're using a completely separate plugin. So I'm going to go ahead and change some of these characteristics really quickly, just drive it a little bit, and we're going to go ahead and see how we can get this sounding. Let's go ahead and play it and see how this sounds with some distortion, cranking this at about 6, added some brightness to it. Here we go.
Sky on fire. Sky on fire. Sky on fire. Sky on fire. No.
So there you go. We can hear some more of that drive going on. So we can hear a lot more of that crunch, a lot more of that distortion on it. All right, so let's listen to it in the context of the track.
Sky on fire.
Now, it's obviously not like super distorted and mangled and crazy. Like, you want to be tasteful with how you do these things, but that sounds great. So let's go ahead and now do it within the actual delay itself. And all that is going to happen right here within the flavor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to crank the tape, swirl, and sauce. And to be honest with you, I don't even know what swirl and sauce actually do. I just know it sounds good. Tape is going to be adding that tape saturation. And then what I'm going to do is add some wideness and some richness to this. These are just some of the settings that I tend to like using on Comeback Kit. Really what I'm trying to show you is that if you are manipulating within the delay itself, it's oftentimes going to have a saturation tool within it or a distortion tool within it, tape emulation within it, all sorts of different things you can do, and you're gonna be able to get very similar results. Go ahead and listen to how this sounds now without using Effect Rack and instead just using the delay itself.
Sky on fire. Sky on fire. No.
So as you can hear, that sounds very similar. It had a little less of the mid-range on it, which in this case is probably a good thing. So you can definitely do that within the actual delay itself if that delay that you're using has that as an option. And that brings me to the next one, and that is you need to make sure that you are automating your delays. If you are not automating your delays, you're really missing out on some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things that you can do. So what I'm talking about specifically is you can automate the volume of a delay. You can automate the mute of a delay. You can automate all sorts of different aspects of a delay. So for example, when I have the verse going on here, if I just play a little bit of this verse to you.
If we die without trying, then it won't mean a thing.
So this particular case, this is a pretty wordy vocal. There's a lot of words happening, the melody is busy. If we were to throw this delay on that vocal, it's gonna sound awful. So what we'd wanna do instead is a couple different things, and there's always more than one way of doing this. This is the way I tend to prefer doing it, is I can jump into automation here, go to latch mode, and I'm gonna leave this on mute, okay? This is the actual bus, I'll rename it here, delay bus. And I'm gonna mute this, okay, initially. And then once we get to the chorus, I'm gonna unmute it. The nice thing is we can actually just jump straight into the chorus here. So I'm gonna just jump straight to the chorus. I'm gonna play a little bit before it. And once she finishes this line, I am going to unmute this bus. But then once she gets to this part of the chorus,
nowhere to run, nowhere to go.
again, this is wordy. She has more words happening. We don't want that delay happening. It's gonna sound really messy. So I'm gonna mute it once they get into this line right here. So just watch how this works. Just be keeping an eye down here on the bus itself. Here we go.
Sky on fire, sky on fire.
Actually, we can skip ahead.
Nowhere to run.
And then now that delay is off, we're gonna set this back to read. And now watch what happens. If I go to the verse, you can see it is muted. And then once I scroll and get to that point, boom, unmute. And then once we get through here, it gets muted again, right there. So if I just play this last line right here, going into this, you'll hear how this delay shuts off once she gets into the next line.
Sky on fire. No.
Now, you heard that cut off a little early, so what we need to do is we need to make sure that we go find where this delay bus is. All right, so we have the delay bus right here. We can just open up the automation, show the actual mute that was used, and we want to make sure that we just move that to where it needs to be.
Nowhere.
So the mute was actually set a little too early. We need to make sure we set it right when that vocal comes in and not too early, or else it does cut off that vocal, which sounds unnatural. So this is why some people might prefer using a volume automation as opposed to using a mute automation. Again, it's just more than one way of doing the exact same thing. It's just there are different things you might need to think about. So if you wanted to do a volume automation, you could literally just go in here, grab the volume, and at the tail end of this, we could just automate this down like this, and then it will more or less fade out as opposed to having a hard cut or hard mute. Now this is obviously just one type of application of automation. So let's just go ahead and say that we were using a delay with a shorter time, something like an eighth note delay or a quarter note delay. Then once she starts singing this line here, that delay is gonna start happening before she finishes the line, which means it could add some mud and some messiness. Now, some people are gonna say you can use sidechain compression. Absolutely possible. You can definitely do that. And actually some of these plugins like the Comeback Kid has a ducker built into it, which is sidechain compression. For me personally, I really like just using volume automation. You have way more control over how it responds, whereas with the compressor, you're gonna be basically spending the same amount of time just tweaking your compressor to get the threshold and to get the attack and the release set, whereas I just prefer using volume. So you could jump in here, and when she's singing, I could basically just grab all this, drop it down, and then make it so that when she's done singing this line, when she finishes this, we ramp up that delay. And so again, that's gonna increase the volume of the delay. Once she finishes, I'm just gonna show you as an example here. This is probably not gonna sound particularly awesome because this particular context, but this is how this could sound.
Sky on fire.
Now again, this is really wet. There's a lot of reverb. It's kind of messing it up. So that doesn't really work too great in this example, but hopefully you can understand the point I'm trying to make. You can just bring the volume of the delay down during the vocal and then bring it up when you want it to actually expand and poke out, so to speak. And when it's all said and done, I'm pretty much always using a combination of all of the techniques that I've talked about in this video. If you just take and use these, they are going to make your delays sound significantly more professional and fit the context of your tracks significantly better. Now I'm starting to live stream every single week where you can actually watch as I produce a song, and if you want to join and be notified when that happens, then text me the word live to 308-248-2058. I'll shoot you a text before we go live each week. The number's on the screen. This song was actually one that I produced live. We'll see you there.